Okay, hello everyone. It's Mrs. Walker, your UAH student intern, and I'm going to be reading Tales from Auschwitz Survivor Stories, which is the stories that we're going to be looking over for the next 2 days. I want to note that this was written in 2015, 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. So we'll begin with Irene's story. Irene Fogelweiss, born in 1930 in Botragi, Czechoslovakia, now Batrad, Ukraine. She lives in Virginia, U.S. She will be returning to Auschwitz for the third time as part of the U.S. presidential delegation, along with her daughter, Leslie Weiss. We lived in Botragi, a very small, mostly poor town in Czechoslovakia, with a population of approximately 1,000 mainly farming families, including 10 Jewish families. The town was a typical low-income community with a tailor, a shoemaker, a grocery store, where people struggled to get by, but where everyone knew each other and there was easy communication between neighbors, though that didn't mean we were equal. When I was 8 years old, Czechoslovakia broke apart and we became part of Hungary. That was when our problems started because the Hungarians were aligned with the Nazis. It was a difficult time for Jewish families, as suddenly the law no longer protected us, and overnight, we lost our civil rights. My father's lumber business was confiscated and given to a non-Jew, and we received no compensation. Jewish children were thrown out of Hungarian schools, so right away we had no choice but to concentrate on hunkering down and trying not to bring attention to ourselves. We couldn't ride the trains, we had to wear the yellow star. It was a free-for-all. With no law to protect us, it was common for Jews to get beaten up or thrown off the train. It was incredibly scary when you're exposed to anyone's raw feelings and enmity. These young Nazis habitually roamed around and did tremendous damage to many individuals. But at least we were still in our community and were not evicted from our home, so that was some comfort. We didn't have radio or much access to newspapers, so all the children were reliant on listening to their parents for information. But I remember many things about the course of the war, who was winning and losing, and the repression of Jews everywhere. Hungary didn't give up its Jewish population until it was invaded by Nazi Germany in 1944. The very first task the German government gave the Hungarians was to round up Jewish families and deport them to Auschwitz. There was a huge rush to take 500,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, and it was completed in just 6 weeks in 147 cattle cars. So in the spring of 1944, my family, my parents, and their 6 children, the oldest of whom was 17 and I was 13, found ourselves in the Mumkaks ghetto, and from there being taken on cattle carts to Auschwitz in Nazi-occupied Poland. Imagine it like this. 3 generations of your family have lived in the same house in the same town. They've struggled to raise a family, put kids through school, to feed them all. You have your friends and family, and all of a sudden you are told to leave it all and walk out with a single suitcase. I remember the night of packing very well. Things went in a suitcase. Things were taken out of the suitcase. In the end, my mother filled it with food she had cooked and warm clothing and bedding. That was it. Then it was full. Plus, we took a watch, some earrings, a wedding ring with us to exchange for food if necessary. The next day, my father was forced to hand over his remaining money to a delegation that included the mayor and the school principal as they rounded us up at the town hall. We had been absolutely unaware of such a place as Auschwitz. It was a stunning reversal of the life we had up until then. And I cannot emphasize enough how utterly scary it is to be at the mercy of your fellow human beings. As a child, I could not understand what we had done to deserve going there. My father surveyed the scene from the train and could see prisoners, uniforms, and barracks, so he immediately thought it was a work camp. And that was reassuring. If we can work, it can't be such a dreadful place. We had heard about the stories in Poland of a lot of mass shootings of Jews or people being taken into the forest and shot, so it was a relief to see out the window that there was actually a system. Even though we were victims of discrimination at that stage, that's all it was, as we had no clue that this was a very carefully orchestrated plan of genocide. We could not have imagined that they would kill little children until we realized that killing children was their primary goal to prevent any new generations. We thought to ourselves, even if we have to work, at least we'll see each other occasionally. But the German system was full of this sort of deception. It counted on people's normal perception of things, thinking we were going to a work camp, thinking that you were going to take a shower when in fact you were going to the gas chambers. That was the ultimate deceit. When we arrived, it was, as I later found out, the usual story, though not to us at the time. Our family was torn apart on the platform at arriving. My sister Serena was chosen for slave labor. My mother and the younger children were sent off to one side, and my family and 16-year-old brother to the other side. I held tightly onto the hand of my 12-year-old sister, and for an instant I was mistaken for being older than I was, probably because I was wearing a headscarf that my mother had given me. My sister was sent with my mother, while I went to the opposite side. That was the first chance I had to survive. Unbeknown to me at the time, 2 Nazi soldiers had been asked to make a photographic document of the deportation of Hungarian Jews from the moment they got off the train through the entire time of arriving, going to the bathhouse and getting their prison clothes. So I ended up in a picture at the very moment I was separated from my sister. It captures me standing alone with my family on the Auschwitz platform, and I'm leaning inwards to see where my little sister has gone. Another picture we discovered shows my family waiting in line for the gas chamber. 2 little boys, my brother, Reuven and Gershon, are shown dressed in hats, one struggling to put on his winter coat. For a long time, I failed to find my mother and was very unhappy. I spent hours looking at these photos with a magnifying glass, and one day I found her little face sticking out. The picture only came to light 25 years ago, and despite them showing moments from around 45 years before that, they completely captured the entire experience as it had been in my mind all the time. I was dumbfounded and devastated, having had no idea they existed, and I have spent literally hundreds of hours scouring them, trying to find my father and brother. The pictures have reassured me that I was not imagining it at all, as I sometimes thought I might have done. The reality of where we were struck home fairly quickly. I was stationed near crematorium number 4, and we witnessed the columns of unsuspecting women and children entering the gate of the crematorium. They would have been dead within half an hour. When the Hungarian Jews arrived, they had the gas chambers going day and night. How can you wrap your imagination around that? I still can't. I was with my older sister, Serena, and we were sent to be forced laborers together in the Birkenau section of Auschwitz. Many times we were threatened with separation, but somehow we managed to stay together. Later on, to our great relief, we ran into my mother's 2 young sisters, our aunts Rose and Piri, who were in their early 20s. It was like finding our parents. They were such a huge moral and emotional support for us. On about 17 January, 18 January 1945, the SS dragged thousands of us out of the camp to walk to Ravensbrück concentration camp deep into central Germany. I don't know really why. We were in terrible straits, with no proper clothes, nothing suitable for marching through the snow. It was as if the cruelty would never end. If anyone sat out of exhaustion, they were shot. Later, we were transported yet again, and my Aunt Piri became ill and was killed. As the Soviets approached, the SS left, and Serena and Rose took shelter in an empty house nearby. The Russians came, but for some reason left immediately again, so we were left to fend for ourselves. We spent months trying to get to Prague, where we knew we had to have some relatives, and from there we went to the Sudetenland. I got to go to school. My sister found work in a factory, and Rose was sick at home with tuberculosis. We initially had no idea what happened to the rest of the family and had no access to a phone, but on buildings everywhere, lists were put up stating who was still alive. Everyone you met, you asked. Every meeting of refugees was dominated by trying to find out where your relatives were. Eventually, I discovered that around 100 people from my town who were deported, only about 10 survived. Only 2 of whom were children, my sister and me. But there was not one parent and child who lived. All of them were killed. This is now the narrator. Serena now lives in New Jersey with her family, including 3 children and grandchildren. Now here we go, back into Serena's story. We've both managed to hang on in there, but she can't come to Auschwitz because her husband is sick. For years, when we talked about our experience, she'd say to me, "You probably don't remember, you were too young," as I was 4 years younger, but some things I remembered even more sharply than her and my aunt. I'm often asked how we coped. I never went to a psychologist and I never will. Quite simply, I kept it at a distance. I saw and understood, and yet I didn't. I never cried over the columns of children and mothers I saw. When I was in Auschwitz, I thought, this is not actually on Earth. It was a system of masters and slaves, gods and subhumans, and I thought to myself, no one knows about it. It's the forest surrounded by multiple layers of fence. It's not actually real. I never let it penetrate that my parents were killed, and I even thought, after this, we're going home and everyone will be there again. Those who never managed to keep it distant killed themselves. I threw myself into my family. I married young. I had 3 children. I now also have 4 grandchildren. And then I went to college and became a teacher. You fall into a routine and do the best you can. But I have never lost the feeling of how unreliable human beings are, and neither am I fooled by superficial civilization. But I realize that loss of faith in people is more devastating than loss of faith in God. I won't be going back to Auschwitz again after this visit, so it's my last chance to make sure this tragedy is not forgotten. I found out only about a week before I was due to leave that I will be one of 2 survivors who will be part of the U.S. presidential delegation, headed by the Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew. And I feel very honored, but it has much to do with the fact that many others who could go are ill or unable to travel. And that's the end of Irene's story. And so for Day 1, if you are in Mrs. McQueen's class, you will either choose between Irene's story or Eva's story coming up. Next, we are going to read Joseph's story, which is also very important for our CFA on Wednesday. Okay. Joseph Manderwitz, born in Trzemiński, Poland in 1923. He now lives in Toms River, New Jersey, and is returning to Auschwitz for the 2nd time with his 2nd cousin. This is his story. We had a quiet life until the day they took 1,000 Jews away from my village of Trzemiński, a typical Polish village with a big square around the community, which community life took place. My father was a bootmaker, my mother was a seamstress, and everyone worked hard. There was always some anti-Semitism, which is discrimination against Jews. But it was mainly fairly harmless, consisting of kids at our school who during religious education taunted the 5 or 6 Jewish kids in the class with "Jews killed Jesus." I had trained as a tailor and had left home before we were deported, when I went to work 4 miles away on a ranch. It was taken over by the SS, so I suddenly found myself working for them. In May 1943, they lined us up one day and told us to empty our pockets. If they found even a single zloty in anyone's pocket, they were shot on the spot. We were transported to Majdanek, which was only 19 miles away, a torture camp in the true sense of the word. For 500 meters, there was just ditches full of bodies, legs, heads. We were deported to Auschwitz 4 weeks later. We arrived in the early morning and they gave us a bed, a real shower. They cleaned us well with disinfectant and shaved us. After that, they gave us striped uniforms and tattooed us. I was given the number 128164 on my left arm, and from that point on, I was a number, no longer a name. From there, we were sent to Buna, an Auschwitz subcamp, and were set to work. After a few months there, I went for a walk one day and saw a few tomatoes growing. I was starving by then, so tried to take them and was given a beating so severe, I don't know how I survived it. I still have the scars from it today. I was taken to the hospital and knew the rule. If you didn't heal in 4 to 5 days, they take you to Birkenau and you'd be gassed. I was 20, about 1.7 meters, 5'7" inches tall, blonde, not bad looking, and despite the beating in pretty good shape. When my limit in the hospital time was up, they sent me to the gas chambers. There, I met Dr. Mengele, who was asking me what was wrong